young men having to make a decision to go to try to flee from their home country. Those have got to be difficult decisions. Those are, in the way we're looking at ethics, those are ethical decisions. They're sorting through the different factors. Do you stay here? Do you go along with it? Just how do you deal with that? And then, of course, also how to deal with then the aftermath of a net crisis, like a natural, we call it natural disaster, although now we have to call natural disasters kind of natural human disasters, because we seem to have some role in making these hurricanes worse. They don't necessarily cause the hurricane, but can add to the amount of moisture and so on. But then how do you make decisions then? And all sorts of decisions have to be made in terms of recovering from something like that, to go along with whatever other issues we're dealing with. Oh, Pam.
Did any of the ordinary Germans, not German Jews or anything, just ordinary German people flee Germany?
Oh, yes. Yeah, some did. Yeah. And some considered it. Bonhoeffer was interesting because he had his sister and brother-in-law, but he did have Jewish background, the brother-in-law did. And so they went to England. And so when Bonhoeffer was served for a couple of years, German-speaking congregations in England, and he connected with them there. So I'll just give you one example of how tricky stuff gets. So it would have been the father of this brother-in-law died in 1933, and he asked Bonhoeffer if he would do like a simple memorial service for him or not. And Bonhoeffer was counseled by the guy that we might say like a bishop type person no, that's going to draw too much attention to the church right now if you do that memorial service, if you have a pastor of that church doing a memorial service. And Bonhoeffer chose not to do it, and I think that was a major regret for him that he voiced to Eberhard Bethge and others. So these are the kind of things you end up having to sort through, and there's different factors at work there, and so you have to sort that through. And he I think in hindsight, he wished he had gone ahead and not been so cautious at that point.
Do you know if any of those Germans came back after Hitler responded?
That's a good question. I wouldn't. The answer is probably yes, but I don't. The question is she's wondering if any ordinary Germans fled Germany when Hitler came to power, and then did any of those go back to Germany? And my guess is, I'm guessing, I don't really. It's interesting. I haven't really focused on that in particular in all this, but I assume yes, some would have gone back. But many, this is when right now we've got Sanctuary Team working on helping an Afghan family that's come to this country, and they're mentioned in the prayers today. Scott is part of that Sanctuary Team. But that's when Lutherans really got involved with helping refugees in the aftermath. A lot of it was in the aftermath, but also during World War II, and helping people who needed a place to go. And then, of course, one of the worst parts of the history is all the people that they had these ships with Jews on them and weren't necessarily accepted. Were turned away when they would come, and that happened in the United States also. It wasn't just other countries out there. All right. Well, today we're going to look at a vocation. And I think sometimes we look at vocation as kind of our job. And that's part of our vocation. But from a faith standpoint, an evangelical Lutheran point of view on this, that's one part of vocation. But we're really talking about our calling. When we talk about vocation, what is our calling, and how do we discern and sort out and live out our calling that we perceive? And so that we're going to take a look at that today, and what can help us, and especially when you think about, I don't know about you, but it just seems like sometimes there's all these different things that need to be done, and how do we do them all? And you can't do them all. And that's true not only for individuals or for households, it's true for congregations, discerning, okay, what are we going to focus on? Because St. Andrew has a history of trying to do a lot of things. I'll just put it that way. And then do a lot of things, and then do new things and keep all the older things going also. That's sort of the pattern here. In one way, it's commendable, but in another way, how do we deal with those? Because you literally can't do everything. And so what do we focus on? That's part of what we're going to look at today. So the priming the pump question there is we're also going to talk about what it means we're free to be responsible. What would that mean? And so in the Pledge of Allegiance, we speak of liberty and justice for all. What do we mean by liberty? And then if you have time, how does this concept of liberty compare with the Christian concept of freedom? Whatever concept of freedom you have from your experience in being a follower of Jesus, part of the church. So look at, but liberty, what are we actually talking about when we talk about liberty? And notice the major battles we have going on in our society and culture right now. They're really arguments about what liberty means. So go ahead, and I'll give you 5, 6, 7 minutes again, this is to prime the pump. Give you another minute or two. The Lord be with you. So let's go ahead. I've got this a little more, there's an extra page attached here, so there's a little more than I usually have, but we'll be able to work through it fairly efficiently. So the first in terms of introduction, bound and free. Now the bound is a tricky word because we tend to have certain connotations go with it, but another way to look at this is we are interconnected. Our well-being is interconnected with the well-being of other people and other creatures. So that may help. It's not just bound in a bad sense is what I'm getting at. But Luther liked to talk about Christians, and he wrote an essay called The Freedom of a Christian. And he liked to say that we're both free, subject to none, as he said, but we're also dutiful servants of all, subject to all. And Luther loved paradoxes, and so he'd say both things are true. Both things are true. The second there is to take that and talk about it, another variation on that in terms of the term responsibility would be the responsible person is bound to God, other humans, and all creation, interconnected with them. Our well-being is interconnected with other humans and all creation and with God, obviously. But at the same time, we are able to respond freely to God, other human beings, and to all God creation. So we have a certain measure of freedom. What I'm getting at here is, yes, we're free, but there's limits to that freedom. It's not like we get to do whatever we want or something. This is a different way of looking at things where, yes, we're free, but we're free in the context of understanding how interconnected we are with God, other human beings, and the creation. So then let's look at an evangelical concept of a responsible person. So my sense of responsibility, I would think growing up, it's all those things you ought to do that you're responsible for. That is part of responsibility, but I want to lift up a more holistic understanding of responsibility for us today. So responsible action is self-giving action in response to God, other human beings, and the whole creation. One, it conforms to Jesus Christ, or as I've talked about so far, where our eyes are on Jesus and who Jesus is, and Jesus, in a sense, is we can look to him as the one who was a responsible person that we can follow. It fully employs our God-given abilities to respond. So we have so think not just responsibility, but ability to respond, or response/ability. We have certain abilities to respond, and then it builds up the community. It's got a positive dimension that way in building up. So what are then our everyday God-given responsibilities? So I'm list a number of them here, and we could talk about any one of these. But in terms of family, interesting enough too, if you go back and study Bonhoeffer on this, Bonhoeffer was very much a part of his Prussian world that he grew up in. And so it's a pretty narrow view of what constitutes the responsibility of family. And so we're trying to go toward a more holistic understanding of that. So it's caring for spouse is one part of it, nurturing children, but also caring for extended family and everything that goes into that. So supporting the family, nurturing growth in faith, and Nurturing children can be, yes, parents have a particular responsibility, but as I talked about in the sermon today, when you're talking about baptism, others, in a sense, participate in that process of nurturing children. What the classic line is, it takes a village to raise a child. But that's a family responsibility, is something that, and even if you have no children, in a sense, we can still participate in that process of nurturing and family and supporting family. Work, so whatever work you have, we get to participate in the action of creation. So God's the creator, and God is at work doing things, but we get to participate in that. And I don't know what we think of work as something you do to earn money, but we're actually participating in what God is up to in the world. I think it gives us a sense, like, puts a emphasis on our work and the importance of our work that we do, whatever that may be. Citizenship, actively participating in the political community and process. Citizenship is not an option, it's a reality. We are citizens, and so how do we go? The question is how we go about fulfilling that responsibility. And there are various ways that we can be actively involved. Then, I don't know if we'd think of this as a responsibility, but culture. So art, music, literature, customs, all that goes into that, that's all part of being a human being and fulfilling our abilities to respond. So I don't know if people would think of it as an ethical act, but when we're singing in worship on Sunday, and we have a keyboard person helping lead, and Becky Vogt was the cantor today. That's actually, they're sharing their ability to respond, and it's an important part of how people are shaped and how a community is shaped, is through things like that. Art can do this. So there's a variety of things that we can be engaged in that support the building up of a community. Friendship. Okay? Friendship's another responsibility. In church, if we were putting its worship as a major focus and mission and all that goes into carrying out our mission, it's all part of what it means to be a responsible human being. Recreation, probably don't think of this normally as, but actually rest is an important part of our ability to respond. Now, the way we could say way to go here at St. Andrew, at least we have self-care as one of our core values. And so in a sense, we've built that into our awareness. I'm not sure how conscious we were when we did that, but self-care is a part of our responsibility, taking care of ourselves, and becomes very practical. If we don't take care of ourselves, it's hard to take care of anybody else too. So that's just, but rest. God rested on the seventh day. That's the Genesis account, is that God rested, and so who are we not to rest if God took time to rest? And renewal, and then enjoyment of creation and play. When we talk about Sabbath rest, it's also a time where we can do things and just enjoy living. Children tend to be much better at this. Adults, unfortunately, it's like we grow up and forget how to play in healthy ways, and things. But kids just play. They're not sitting there thinking, I shouldn't be playing. That's part of it. And then the last one I mentioned there is education. So all of these are part of our various abilities to respond. And education, again, from a faith standpoint, part of our responsibility. Here you are fulfilling that today by spending time on this. But also, when we read, we have conversations, and all that goes into our growth in faith is all part of the educational process. But everything we do maybe you're learning a new skill. Or I had an 89-year-old lady in McMinnville, 89 years old, and her sight was failing her. She loved to read, and her sight was failing her. And she she couldn't read anymore, so she started listening to books on tape and the Bible on tape. I think she went through the Bible like 3 times, listening to it on tape. That's a lot of time. But even then, hearing became a problem. Well, her mind still worked, because I'd visit and I'd have to talk pretty loud, but you could tell the mind was still working, and remember her line was, well, I'm not sure I quite follow you there or agree with you, but you've given me something to think about. That was kind of her standard line. She decided to take up playing the piano when she was 89. And she didn't become, obviously, an expert pianist, but she learned how to play a couple of Christmas carols. But that was that sense for her, that was just part of her calling, her vocation, was to continue to learn and grow. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the need to balance our responsibilities. This can get tricky. Wonderful quotation, Karl Barth, Bonhoeffer, I don't think either of them came up with it, but it says, we don't have to live as Hercules at a crossroads. So it's not like it's not like every decision we make is just this, oh, what am I going to do? This is too hard. But we don't have to live like that all the time, all right? So there's because that would just wear us out. If we were like every decision you make during a day, if it was a major issue and you had to do a ethical case study on it and figure out how to do it, we can't live that way. That's not practical, and it's not healthy to be constantly wearing ourselves out and fretting about whether we're doing the right thing or not. Am I being a good person now if I do this? And so every moment of the day is not a great crisis. And so we're free to carry out our God-given responsibilities without having to dissect every action we engage in. So, for example, if you're a teacher, you'll go and you teach for the day, and it doesn't mean you don't evaluate, but during the day, just go and be the teacher, and you just do the best you can during that day. You teach, and then you can take time to evaluate along the way and assess how you're doing, what's working, what's not working. But you've got to just be a teacher for that day. If you're you could be a medical field. You just got to do your job. You can't be psyching out every last decision you're making. Now, you may end up with a case that's a real difficult one, and then you have to sort that one out. And I remember when I was on an ethics committee at Legacy Emmanuel Hospital back in the 90s, and there were a couple of situations that I got called in on. I was from McMinnville, so I was far away, but they called me in for a couple, and we had to advise a family that was struggling on, whether to, back then we called it pulling the plug, and they wanted some help sorting that out. We couldn't make the decision for them, but we helped them. But much of the time, what goes on there is just good care, and you don't have to dissect everything you're doing there. And then, so you can go as your parent. Man, think of how crazy you'd go if you had to dissect every decision you make as a parent. It would be overwhelming. So we have these responsibilities. Hopefully, much of the time, it'll kind of balance and work together, and then occasionally we'll run into something where it becomes very difficult, and it really is a challenge to figure out what we're being called to do. In terms of a public figure, I mentioned Martin Luther King Jr., and yeah, it's great that he was involved in the civil rights movement, but boy, did his family pay a price for him being involved in the civil rights movement. So occasionally we hit situations like that where it really is difficult to balance all those things that we're able to do. And the other thing I would say is we tend to maybe give, if it's something you ought to do or we have a sense of obligation, but we need to give some of these things like music and various things, those kinds of abilities too, they need their due also in our time. And so it's not automatic that you always give up on those. Some of our best, most creative people, that takes a lot of time for them to do what they're doing. Now, every once in a while, as I mentioned, you could hit an extraordinary situation, and it's where a bold, risk-filled venture of responsibility is called for. Of course, Bonhoeffer is one example of that, where he finally got involved in a conspiracy to assassinate the head of state. May God spare us from having to make those kinds of decisions. But that can happen. It could happen when you're trying to decide you've got a loved one and you're having to make a decision about whether to continue treatment or withdraw treatment. And it there may be guidelines and guidance, but it may just come down to where somebody's got to make a decision, and you're the one that's the one that needs to make a decision like that. So in those situations, the difficult part is, that's why I meant Martin Luther King Jr. too, is that action that you may discern that you are being called to take may be in opposition to everyday responsibilities. It makes it impossible for you to fulfill your everyday responsibilities. And that's hard. There's just no getting around that. That's hard. And sometimes it may feel like there's no ground under your feet. That's a quote from Bonhoeffer talking to some of his fellow conspirators. But that can happen not just in situations like that, but where you just go, man, I just don't know exactly which way to go on this one. And those are not easy decisions to make. And in terms of Bonhoeffer, by the way, there was no precedent for a Lutheran pastor in Germany to be involved in a conspiracy like he was against a political leader. His dear friend Eberhard Becky said there was no attempt to justify this action before or after the fact. I mean, you're still involved in murdering somebody. So even though you might make a case that we need to put an end to this guy's life, it's not like it's a pure kind of thing that you can do. And then he'd like to say it was one thing to give an account of what compelled this action, but any justification of it would be ethical arrogance in his view. So you can give an account, but giving an account can quickly become justifying our action. And if you think about it, and I would bet that all of us fall into this in various times and places, we'll start talking about something we want to do or that we've done, and it can be real subtle or it can be real obvious, is we want to make sure we did the right thing or we're going to do the right thing. And in tough situations, that is hard to do. It is hard to give that kind of justification, and it's really not the point. The point is to sort it out and make a decision and then live with it. The good news in all this is for people who, if you do ethics this way, you want to have a very strong doctrine of grace, a real strong sense of being loved by God, and the good news is that God's not going to permanently reject us because we didn't get it right or something like that. That's not how a God of grace works. This is an interest, the willingness to become guilty, the law of Christ. So in Galatians 6:2, let me just read that for you. It says, bear one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Even someone's guilt is a burden that we're called to bear. So how might that manifest itself? Let's say the church ends up, let's go back to if you remember the Iraq War, and not everybody was supportive of the United States getting involved in the Iraq War. And I heard some interesting comments, even from people that had been influenced by Bonhoeffer, who said, well, I didn't want that war, and it's almost like, so I'm not responsible for it. Notice what's going on there. No, this is our nation, and this is our nation, and our nation's getting involved in this. We may not agree with what the nation is doing, but we still share the guilt of that, even though we may have not wanted it to happen. Because the point, again, is not to justify and say, well, I got it right, I didn't support that. That's not the point. The point is, what is the country going through, and what did we get involved in? And so we share that guilt. You can imagine this at a family level, even. And rather that one of the family members gets in trouble. One way to respond was, you got yourself into that mess, you deal with it. Well, they might have to deal with it, but if one of my kids ends up in prison, I'm going to visit him still. And then I might even be willing not to excuse behavior, but to say, okay, not only is there anything that I was part of in contributing to why they did what they did, but then the big question is what can be done to bring healing in a situation like that? So again, seeing ourselves as part of a family, a community, a nation, rather than kind of, oh, we're not those people. And look what's going on. When you talk about the battles going on in our country at a big level, you've got two groups of people who, and if we're just, our whole goal is to say they're more evil than we are, that doesn't really help much. It doesn't help deal with it. Now, it can be difficult when you have people that are not willing to take responsibility for it, but it's just basic to who we are. You take responsibility. Bonhoeffer had to make a decision to go. He could have stayed in the United States, become a professor, might have even got to meet him if he'd have done that. But had been teaching at a Lutheran seminary, maybe in Chicago where I went to seminary. But he chose to go back to Germany because he realized if I'm not in Germany now when the going is tough, then I'm not going to be there. Then who am I to go back after the war and kind of say this is what you need to do? So he went back, and it ended up probably costing him his life. Again, think of that in terms of family situations where we can try to, this is not about washing our hands. This is not Pilate, washing his hands and not wanting to take responsibility. We're called to enter into it as best we can and deal with it, especially when you get these extraordinary situations. So notice, real innocence is not keeping oneself free from the taint of sin and guilt, but willingly entering into the community of guilt for the sake of others. It's a wonderful quotation from Bonhoeffer's Ethics where he said, sometimes we're choosing between right and right, and sometimes we're teaching between wrong and wrong.
I think one of the perfect examples of this is the discussions in terms of reparations for
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
for indigenous peoples and so those, I think that's a perfect example of making amends for wrongs that occurred.
Yeah, so I just want to repeat that for those that are going to watch this. So it's the issue of reparations, and that is an example because one of the things, it's not my fault. I wasn't the one that had slaves, so how am I responsible for that? And is one of the arguments you'll hear. But in fact, that's shaped our history so much that there's no way to be part of this nation without somehow being connected with what happened. And the issue is, again, in order to bring healing and reparations and so on, it's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but somehow we need the nation as a whole to engage with this. So yeah, trying to wash our hands of that and say, well, I wasn't part of it, we're missing something when we do that. Thanks, Luann, that's helpful. Good example. Peggy.
I think limited immunity for the police is a power that's maybe is abused now. Maybe it started out with a reason to have it, but I think we all have to look at responsibilities for allowing the organization to kill people to decide their fate and killing like that.
Yeah, so Peggy's bringing up the issue of immunity, limited immunity for law enforcement officers. Yeah. So yeah, you're seeing this. So it's, again, we have a tendency in our Lutheran tradition, not just Lutherans, but to think of ethical things and responsibility in individual terms. But what's really needed is an ability to think also as a part of a corporate way, like I'm part of a family, or I'm part of a church, or I'm part of a community, or I'm part of a nation. That can be a challenge for us to think that way. Just because of the way we've tended to look at ethics and pretty like doing the right thing or the wrong thing. Well, that's part of it, but that's we're never just individuals. We're always interconnected with others. That in terms of freedom, in Galatians 5:1, it says, "For freedom Christ has set us free." What's a yoke of slavery there? It's actually when we seek to be justified, where we want to know I'm right or I'm not wrong or whatever it may be. That is actually, Paul says, a yoke of slavery. And then there's also a form of just self-indulgence where we're basically doing our own thing. And boy, that understanding of freedom is really strong right now in our culture. And and it's been before. It's just coming out more strongly now. But doing your own thing, this is not how, at least from a faith perspective, that's not how we view freedom. True freedom, then, is where we're serving God, other human beings, and all creation. So it's in serving that we're actually free. And then the other thing is that we have a real responsibility for shaping the events of life and history. So that's, it makes a difference what we think, say, and do. We're participating in what God is up to. It's not just like we can sit back and God will take care of it all for us. That's not how we understand it. And finally, we need to let God be the ultimate judge of our actions. Now, we make judgments. I'm not saying we don't make judgments along the way, but God finally is the ultimate judge. We don't, our viewpoint is too limited for us to be the ultimate judge of things. And Lord have mercy when human beings take on, presume to have that kind of ability to judge. And then if God is a judge, but the good news again is the God who's judging us is a God who we believe loves us. So it makes a big difference knowing that the one who judges is not going to permanently reject us or because of what we've done. And then sin, Luther liked to talk about sin and boldly. It's not just go out and do a bunch of sins. It's okay, God will forgive you. That's a misreading of what that's about. But sin boldly means at a certain point we do have to decide and act, and it may not be perfectly clear which way to go, but you still have to make the action, and we should not be afraid finally to decide and act in certain situations. So, and then I'll go back to reparations here. You know, it's important that we act on that, and we may end up doing some things that aren't adequate, but they're first steps. But you do that, and then you see, sometimes we have to do things and then see how they work and make adjustments and so on. But simply to do nothing, doing nothing is actually, it's even when we talk about politics, faith in politics, we don't want any politics in the pulpit. That's actually a political decision to have no politics in the pulpit. You are making, you cannot get outside of this. The question is what you're talking about and what you're, where does that come from? But there's no way to avoid politics. It'd be like saying, well, we're not going to be a nation, we're not going to make decisions. You can't avoid that. So it's how do we enter into that process? And that's where the discussion can be. Let me just quickly go through this discerning one's calling or vocation. And again, this isn't just about your job. So, I'm looking to retire, but my vocation is going to continue. This will be the next venture, so to speak, as Phil Stroiver talks about, is the next venture. And we're still discerning our vocation and calling throughout our lives. So it's not extended or limited on a basis of principle. We like to kind of narrow, okay, I'm only going to do, I'm a doctor, and so the only thing I'm responsible for is being at the bedside and helping at the bedside. No, you might be a doctor that should be down in Salem advocating for a certain bill that's going to help people who are struggling. So it may not be that simple. Or you may have to decide in a crisis situation, we have doctors or medical personnel that'll feel compelled to go overseas or something like that, or whatever. You can't simply just narrowly define your vocation. Zealous reformers must guard against equating their reforming impulses with the call of Jesus. So our zeal can get the best of us. That can happen on the right and on the left, by the way. There's both the right and the left are very capable of becoming so zealous that they can't even, they're so sure they're doing the right thing that they are not open to constructive criticism. And the same, we can be overly cautious, duty-bound, law-abiding, and prudent. And so we can try to narrowly limit the scope of our responsibility. We need to focus on what God is calling us through Jesus and not on ourselves per se. We need to really discern what is it that we're being called to do. A fifth criterion I would add to this is to take into account the effect not just on human individuals in society, but on the whole creation. We're much more aware of that now. And we ignore that to our peril. And used to be we were just talking about it, and now we see it on the television when you have 12 inches of rain in some short period of time. I mean, these things are just hitting us right in the face, so to speak. We need who's my neighbor? That question, it could be somebody next door, but it also could be someone very remote. The sanctuary, the family that we're helping right now is from Afghanistan. So they're close now, but they were from Afghanistan's pretty remote in one way. Again, the neighbor is not simply the person who's right next door. It could be somebody who's much more what we would think of as remote than that. Need a willingness to enter the fray. So non-involvement in something to protect our ethical purity is irresponsible. Non-involvement for the sake of the neighbor may be a fitting response. So there may be a situation where not getting involved is the way to go, but it's done as a thoughtful response to a situation. And then just some questions that may be helpful. Is this the kind of work or activity for which I'm suited in temperament, intelligence, and training? Is this work that I can enjoy and from which I can draw a sense of accomplishment and fulfillment? Does my occupation profession fit into the larger sense of vocation given by the gospel? And does God need this done to help in the transformation of myself, my neighbor, and the world? And those questions, again, yes, they can be helpful in terms of your day job, so to speak, but this applies to just discerning, what am I going to do today, this week, this month, and so on. Those are questions that can be helpful with that. I'm going to take, I think I'll be okay for sir, I want to have a little time more too. I've got about 5 minutes here. Any comments or questions that people want to lift up? Peggy, and I'm going to bring the mic so they'll hear you actually.
It's real simple. I don't understand number 4. I don't understand the two things here. They seem opposite.
All right, if you said, I'm not going to get involved in this, for example, Trinity Lutheran in Tacoma had an amazing food bank, and people supported it really, really well. And people support food bank here really, really well. Try to get somebody to go down to there, it would have been in Washington, it was Olympia, and get involved in some legislative measure that might help the hungry. That's messier. So we don't want to get involved in that. I want to do the thing I can be sure I'm doing the right thing, so I'll help with the food bank. Again, helping with the food bank was a good thing, but it also, we may be aware of things and we need to get involved politically in something. Then the second part, non-involvement for the sake of the neighbor. There may be a situation, and boy, I'd like to, trying to think of one off the top, where it's good not to get involved, but you would do that because getting involved is going to do this. It's going to create some unintended consequences in that. So I'm really talking about, the concern is there has been a pretty strong strain in our tradition of people just not getting involved in certain kind of political things and that. And if that can be a strategy that makes sense, but it's a thoughtful response to that. Generally, we're going to be called to get involved in some way. Yeah. Anything else?
I'm interested in this place where you've written evangelical concept of the responsible person. How is that contrasted with Christian concept of the responsible person?
I just used evangelical there because you could say Christian too. But I'm using evangelical because we're evangelical Lutherans, and the evangelical comes from the Greek word, probably gospel. So what does this look like from what's an ethic or an understanding of the responsible person that's takes the gospel seriously, with our eyes on Jesus, so to speak. But Christian could go there too. Yeah. Anything else? Oh, there we go.
Well, I have a comment about reparation. It seems to me that most of the wars that the United States has been involved in, we end up helping those countries that we bombed, to eternity. And it's just curious to me that there's so much resistance to reparations in terms of African Americans and Native Americans, and thinking about all those children that went to boarding schools and things like that. So I don't have any answers to my question, but why are we so willing to help people that we have been at war with, and we're not so willing to help people that we try to exterminate, or people that we enslaved?
I don't know exactly what Bonhoeffer would say about that, but this is maybe one part of it. I do think there's facing those issues about what we've done to Native Americans and what we did in terms of slavery. There is this sense in which we Americans like to think of ourselves as righteous people, a righteous nation and righteous people. So I think part of it may be, I don't want to give too simplistic an answer here, part of it is, it's like the secret in your family that you really don't want to have to talk about or face because it's just too painful to talk about it. I think that's part of what's going on here. It's just too painful to admit that basically that is, when the history books keep writing about what we did in terms of slavery and to the Native Americans, we don't come out looking that good. And you think of South Africa has to deal, part of their history is apartheid. Our history isn't much cleaner than that. So I think it's hard for us to deal with what we've done and just face up to it. Two more remarks here.
I think perhaps we felt like we couldn't help ourselves. We couldn't help it. We needed cotton, we needed to grow, we needed to live, and so we needed these people, and so we had to have them, and we couldn't pay them because then we couldn't make any money ourselves. And we moved into this land because we needed more land, and these people were here, and they didn't want to share. They wanted all of it, and we couldn't help it, whether we could or not.
Well, I don't know if you can help wanting to be rich, but I was thinking that in response to the Marshall Plan, that started after World War II and before the Marshall Plan, partly because we made such a mistake after World War I, and that we didn't start helping countries that we damaged until after World War II. And so part of the problem with the Indians and the African Americans is that they came earlier. We don't have that tradition of in place of doing something about things that happened before World War II. So now applying the Marshall Plan to what happened earlier would maybe show us a pattern. I don't know, but.
No, that was, and certainly the case has been made that the way we handled World War I had really, and can't say that's the whole reason Hitler came to power, but it appears to be one of the reasons he came to power, and it's why German people, so many of them, were ecstatic about Hitler coming to power and restoring German pride and so on. Now, again, it fell apart eventually, but that was part of the driving thing. And even the Bonhoeffer family, the Versailles Treaty was not appreciated by hardly anybody in Germany because they thought that it was like, we're going to put all the blame on Germany for World War I. I'm simplifying here. But when we want to put all the blame on somebody, that often leads to other consequences down the line. And so yes, it's not to let somebody off the hook, but it helps for us to be self-critical in a constructive way, both as individuals, families, nations, communities, and so on. And that's a tough thing to do for people often. Pam, I'm going to give one more word. You're it.
I was reminded of my own personal gripe. My sister did something to me and continued to do it when she was a kid, and I didn't like it, and I didn't think it was fair. And when I approach her about it, she says, "But Pammy, I was a kid." But that doesn't excuse. And because we had to, or because it doesn't excuse what we did to the Indians. It doesn't matter that we were kids, that we didn't.
All right, I got one more comment here.
Okay. So, we were just on vacation traveling around to national parks, and we went to the Little Bighorn battlefield. And years ago, it was only the U.S. soldiers that had grave markers and were commemorated. And now, the Indians that fell in that battle, there are grave markers and plaques and information given about what they experienced. So it's a much more even approach. And I think just in terms of things like that, having the extra information is going to teach us more about our role in the situation.
Some measure of accountability there, at least. It's at least a step in the right direction. Well, thank you. Appreciate the comments there at the end. And so next week, I'm going to be in Ohio doing a Bonhoeffer weekend. But there'll be Adult Ed here, special topic, countdown to burning the mortgage. So if you have any comments, questions, please show up and voice those, because that will really help shape the process of moving toward burning the mortgage. And the stewardship committee would love to have feedback and questions and just how's this going to happen? It might be all right, go in peace, serve the Lord. And I will be back in 2 weeks. We'll look at the church turned inside out. So that'll be the focus.